Thank you all for coming. This is really quite a surprise to have this big of a group, although I do know that the peach industry in Catawba is of great interest to a lot of you. So let's do a poll here. How many, raise your hand if you live at least part-time in Catawba. Wow, yeah, all right. Raise your hand if you have ever grown a peach tree. Raise your hand if that experience was horrible. Raise your hand if you ever, of those that raised your hand with the peach tree, how many of you had more than 3 or 4 years of peaches? Not bad, we got it down to 3 or 4 people. How many of you have ever tasted a store-bought peach? How many of you have ever tasted a locally grown peach? How many of you think there's a little bit of a difference? And that's what this is all about, because the people way back over 100 years ago thought, you know what, there is a difference in locally grown versus canned in their days. And they didn't probably have a lot of grocery stores to go to, but they had a lot of canned peaches to choose from. So, with that being said, I'm going to go back into a little bit of Catawba Island itself, and then mostly into peaches. I'm going to throw some tangents at you because I gathered a lot of information over the years. But be aware that a lot of the information I've gathered has been through word of mouth, which means it changed many times before it got to me, and probably changed after it got to me because I couldn't remember it. And a lot of the things were not documented. Back in the days when I was gathering information, I didn't footnote everything I gathered. I do have files and files and files of information, so there is a lot of documentation. But with that being said, you're liable to have a different version of some things that you hear. And that's okay. It's to be expected. That's true of all history. It's always through the eyes of the beholder. So some of the things I documented contradict each other. So I may even explain how we have 2 different views on this one item. And I'll get into some tangents because they gave me a little more time than the last time I spoke about a year ago to a small group. And it was at the Orchard, and we got to have drinks beforehand, so it went really, really well. No drinks this time, so we'll see. So, 1836 is when, according to my records, oops, somebody locked the door. 1836 is when people started coming out to Catawba to live, according to my records. In 1836, if you lived someplace, what did you have to do to maintain a livelihood? You had to have a small farm. You had to grow some crops, whether they're just for your own consumption or for you to sell in order to buy somebody else's goods. So most of the people that came out to Catawba had a small farm. They may have easily had a cow or 2. They probably had chicken coops and had chickens so that they had eggs and milk. And then what are they going to grow? Well, if you come to Catawba, you realize that Catawba is somewhat unique in growing in that 2 things, 3 things maybe. One, there's a lot of limestone in the ground. It's very good for growing. There's also a lot of clay, which for a lot of other plants is not a good thing to have. There's also a lot of rock. Most of you raised your hands, you live here, you know that right here, there could be 20 feet of soil, and right here there could be a rock that's exposed to the surface. It isn't really good for row crops, especially. But what it is good for, because it's surrounded by, and here's one of those things that changes over the years, exactly 72.332 bazillion gallons of Lake Erie water. It's kept warm by all the water, so in the spring, the crops that you have that have blossoms do a little bit better here than even 5 or 10 miles south of here, where they can be frozen off. So it's really good for crops that have blossoms. And what was the really hot item in blossoms in the early 1800s? Grapes. grapes. Catawba became completely covered with grapes. And the reason for that was there was a gentleman named Nicholas Longworth in Cincinnati who had found a grape in North Carolina along the Catawba River. It was a native grape, and it was called the Catawba grape. And he took it up to Cincinnati, where one report says he was a banker and another report says he was a lawyer. I don't know which it was, but he became really famous for being the first influencer, before the internet and things. He was an influencer for the Catawba grape, and he did a hell of a job. He had vineyards like crazy. He did not have a winery, according to what I read, but he did have connections with people that had wineries, and he propagated the Catawba grape, and he promoted the Catawba grape beyond all belief. In fact, his most popular form of the Catawba grape was a sparkling Catawba grape. It compared very close to champagne. Now, you're all thinking, well, it couldn't be that big of a thing, but it was huge. And according to my notes, champagne actually didn't become super popular until the mid-1800s itself. In 1800, there were only 300,000 bottles of champagne made. So champagne didn't have a tremendous head start on sparkling Catawba wine. He got it so popular. Well, let me tell you a little bit real quickly. This is one of my tangents that I'll throw in. Champagne is only champagne because it's grown in the Champagne region of, I think, France or something. They have all these rules. But the way they make it sparkling is you make your wine, you let it ferment in the oak barrels or whatever barrels you have, and then you bottle it, and then you add some more sugar and or yeast, and you cork it. And then you turn it upside down, and it will start fermenting again. And as it ferments, it builds up carbon dioxide. And the reason you set it upside down is so that it's called the lees. It's the leftover garbage from the yeast will settle down to the bottom. So they would have all these bottles, and they'd have to turn them so that the lees would get down to the bottom. Then, after that has fermented long enough to create enough carbon dioxide to make it sparkling, they would actually freeze the neck of the bottle, take the temporary cork out, the lees and the junk would be forced out by the pressure from the rest of the bottle. They then cap it off. Well, actually, they'd fill it with a little more wine and cap it permanently. Now you've got carbon dioxide. That's the process that Nicholas Longworth promoted for the Catawba grape. And it took off like crazy. I'm telling you, they sent Catawba sparkling wines to California. It was being exported to Europe. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, thank you. You recognize the name? He wrote a lengthy poem about the wonderful ode to Catawba wine. You look it up on the internet. It's very lengthy. I have it printed out if anybody wants to look at it later. But this one, in 1854, he wrote this long poem about it. But I'll just read you this one little part. Very good in its way is the Vernazzi, or the Sillery soft creamy, but Catawba wine has a taste more divine, more dulcet, delicious, and dreamy. The whole poem goes on. It was big. So what did the farmers, the first ones that came to Catawba, they said, well, we ought to grow grapes because we can make a lot more money selling these Catawba grapes than selling wheat or something that we can't hardly grow anyway, and we're in how many bazillion gallons of water? Did anybody? What? Yeah, there you go. She got it. She's taking notes. That's the scientific number. I don't know if it's plus or minus. So they started growing grapes, and the grapes took off like crazy, and more people moved to Catawba, and more people planted more grapes, and the whole eastern part of Ottawa County became a grape mecca. At its height, Catawba produced over 1 million pounds of grapes. And eastern Ottawa County produced over 5 million pounds of grapes. There were 71 wineries within a 10-mile wagon trip from this spot. 71 wineries. Of course, back in those days, it was a lot easier to transport the bottles once they were turned into wine than it was to put the grapes in a wagon. So wherever the grapes were grown, that's where the wineries were. There were 3 in Catawba. There were 7 on Kelly's Island, and there were 25 in Sandusky, and they fill in all the rest. But there were 71 wineries right here. It was going great guns. Everything was going along fine. And in 1863, let me backtrack. Just before 1863, 2 of the largest wine growers, a fellow named Walter Smith and Ira, I couldn't make it out in the records, Deutschen or Deutschen? Dutcher? Yeah, thank you. Those 2 gentlemen went knocking door to door of the residents of Catawba Island, and they wanted to get the township name changed from, and this, I didn't even bother to write it down because I know you guys would know. What? Van Rensselaer Township. Welcome to Van Rensselaer Township, whatever it was. These 2 guys that had Catawba grapes coming out of their ears and thought, we are going to be the mecca of the world for Catawba sparkling wine, went knocking door to door to door and said, we want to change from Van Rensselaer, whatever, to Catawba Island Township. And I can tell you the vote, someplace here I wrote down, the vote was 34 yays and 14 nays. And so in 1863, we became Catawba Island Township. And that's kind of ironic because around 1860 is when the black 2 diseases were going through the grapes. Around 1860, the grapes were starting to go downhill dramatically. They had black rot and powdery mildew. Were going through all the grapes in Ohio. And the crops were going downhill dramatically. Now they just got it changed to Catawba Island Township, and 3 years before is when all the grapes started suffering big time. Not only that, but if you look at your history, and you guys do, in 1870 they diverted the Portage River, and we were technically at somewhere along that time, only 7 years after they changed it to Catawba Island Township. We became not as much Catawba, and certainly not as much island, because we became a peninsula. As soon as when they diverted the Portage River, we were no longer, I don't know if they had to put bridges over it or whatever, but we were no longer an island either. So these guys did all this work to get the grapes going, and then they started petering out. Now, the grapes are going downhill. The guys are starting to get a little worried. They're still fighting with the grape crops. Along came a gentleman named James Gamble. And James Gamble, in 1869, planted 1,000 peach trees. There are records of his neighbors saying, "You are nuts. This is grape country. This isn't peach country." He said, no. So, but I want to share with you that it wasn't such a gamble for him, because James Gamble grew up in Highland County, Ohio, which is just east of Cincinnati. And if it weren't for the Civil War, he would have harvested his first crop of peaches in 1861. So by 1856, 57, he had an orchard of peaches planted in Highland County, just east of Cincinnati. Well, the Civil War came along. He was one of the big charge of people to sign up. James Gamble signed up and here was a conflict of information. One place said he signed up in the 2nd Ohio Voluntary Infantry, and another place said the 15th Ohio Voluntary Infantry Regiment. If he was in the 2nd, he would have fought in the Battle of Bull Run, and if he was in the 15th, he would have fought in some other battles, which I'll go over here. I tend to believe he was in the 15th. I've looked at rosters from the 2nd Ohio, and there was a J. Gamble listed there, but that person was 15 or 20 years older than James Gamble. And also they were recruited. The 2nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry was mostly Cincinnati. Hamilton County tended to be more of the 15th Ohio. And if he was in the 15th Ohio, I'll tell you real briefly, that means that he would have fought first of all in December of 62 in the Battle of Stones River. In September of 63, he would have fought in the Battle of Chickamauga. And in July of 64, he would have been involved in the siege on Atlanta. And followed after that, he would have been in the March to the Sea with Sherman. That's what the 15th Ohio Volunteer Infantry was involved in. It was very bloody. It was very, very nasty. And one of my little tangents is one of the things that made it so extremely deadly is not only the method that they fought, because they would just line up and walk towards the other group until they could shoot them down, but the Union armies by then had the modern weapon had changed from a smoothbore rifle with a ball bearing in it. You know, you'd be shooting a ball bearing at somebody through a rifle. It'd be like throwing a knuckleball. So they weren't extremely accurate. But the Union Army got the first rifled barrels along with what's called a mini ball. It was a cartridge. It was elongated so that when it shot, it spun. And the reports are that they were accurate up to 300 to 400 yards. So when the Confederate forces in particular, because the Union got these first, would come marching in formation, they could start, the Union people could start plunking them down from very far away. And just briefly, in the first battle, it started with 41,000 men, and 13,000 of them were casualties. In the second battle I mentioned, there were 58,000 men to start and 16,000 casualties. So it turns out that at every one of the battles he was probably in, they lost about a third of their force. And he was in one after another, as they all were. Anyway, he was mustered out of the Union Army in 65. He married Rose Veeder in December, Christmas Eve. He was a romantic. So we can, Christmas Eve in 1866, and then he came to Catawba. I can't establish why he came to Catawba from Highland County. I have records of other people named Gamble that were in Catawba. I don't know if they came before him or not, but I know they're not his father, and I know they're not his siblings. Whether they're cousins or aunts or an uncle, I couldn't tell you, but something brought him here. He decided he's going to grow peaches. It also wasn't a gamble because there were some peaches being grown in the area. In 1873, Carroll Township harvested 419 bushel of peaches. Oak Harbor harvested 283 bushel of peaches, and Danbury harvested 447 bushel of peaches. So there was a little bit of it going on. So, you know, as much as we like to give him all the credit in the world, there was something else going on there. And another, Andrew Reynolds, must have been a good buddy, because the very next year he planted 1,000 trees also. And then it started to grow, and it started to take off. They started to plant the peach trees in the rows between the vines of the grapes, and they phased out the grapes. Not completely. They all grew. In fact, James Gamble himself, he retained 500 apple trees, because he could get 30 to 35 cents a bushel for selling apples. But the peaches, he could get $1 to $2.50 per bushel selling peaches. So he did phase things out, as they all did, but they all kept a lot of their other things. Heavy hitters. A lot of you are Catawbaites, so I have a list of some of the early peach growers and some of the early heavy hitters. You may recognize some of these names, but most of the names we recognize for Catawba peaches really came in the late 1890s. So the early ones, the 1869, the ones that were the trailblazers, James Gamble had 25 in 1879, 10 years after the first ones were planted. James Gamble had 1,200 trees. Walter Smith, the knock on the door guy, he had 700 trees. Andrew Reynolds, who started the second year, he had 3,000 trees. And Ira Dutcher had 900 trees. Emily Neal and some other Neal family had 1,300 trees. Ira Eden had 1,260 trees. Gideon Owen, that name you may recognize, had 2,000 trees. There was another Owen family member that had 2,500 trees. Those are staggering amounts for trees. But wait till you hear how it got a little later on. Herbert Newton had 2,100 trees. J.R. Newton had 1,500. Sam Smith, Jacob Smith, Calvin Brown, John Wolfe, S.R. Stevens, and it looked like Benedict Thomas. I couldn't make it out. Those were the early hitters. They were the ones that were the pioneers. They went on faith and put in the trees. But 10 years after the original trees put in by Gamble, only 4 of them were harvesting significant amounts of peaches. That tells me that all those names other than Gamble, Smith, Reynolds, and Deutscher came later. Because when you plant a peach tree, it's going to take, today it takes 3 to 4 years to produce peaches. In those days, it probably took 4 to 5 years. And they were not harvesting peaches yet in '79. So that tells me, infers that they actually didn't plant until the mid-'70s. They were the big hitters. And later on, we'll come up with the names that you all recognize, the Rothkars and the other names that every one of you has heard some of those names. These are the 1860s to 1870s names. Okay, the varieties he planted. How many varieties of peaches do we suppose there are? 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10. How many? What? There are over 400 varieties of peaches. There weren't then. In fact, there were much fewer than that then. There were probably 15 or 20 varieties of peaches. I'll get into that later on. They all taste the same. They're not like apples. The apples, they all taste different. But peaches taste pretty much the same. It's just different sizes, colors, ripening dates. But we'll get to that later. The ones that he planted were the Mountain Rose, the Early Crawford, the Late Crawford, Smock, Salway, and Pioneer. None of those names you've heard of anymore. In fact, most of you probably never heard of anything but Red Haven, but that's another story. In fact, we'll get to that later too. So things went along very well. In 1889, a grower, William Miller, does that name ring a bell? William Miller, isn't that as in the Miller boat lines? William Miller planted 1,900 of a brand new variety. There was a variety that was taking this country by storm. The variety was called Alberta. And a lot of you have actually heard of the Alberta. In fact, by the early 1900s, 75% of all the peaches grown on Catawba were Alberta. William Miller in 1889 planted 1,900 Alberta trees. James Gamble himself ripped out the trees that he had planted in 1869, those that still remained, because a peach tree only lives to be 16, 18 years old, and it dies of old age. Somebody said, well, it's like dog years. And I said, yeah, it's peach years. But the remaining trees he had, he ripped out and planted Alberta peaches. Now, the Alberta peach was very, very popular because in those days, 98.623% of all peaches were used for canning. There wasn't a lot of fresh eating of peaches. So these folks who worked their farm, they took care of the cow, they took care of the chickens, they wanted peaches that would ship really well and would can really well. The Alberta peach was a little bit sweeter than some of the others. In fact, the Alberta was discovered in Macon, Georgia. A woman named Clara Rumpf had planted like 1,000 trees that she got from her father, who was a peach grower in Georgia. And one of those trees was a little bit different. It was a little bit sweeter, had a little bit less acid, and it was a little bit more firm than the other peaches. So they propagated that tree. They made that one tree into thousands of trees. And Samuel Rumpf was a wise man because he named the tree after his wife, whose name was Clara Alberta Moore Rumpf. So he named it after his wife. And by 1880, they were selling these everywhere. It was the new wave. You know, forget the Catawba peach. It's all about Alberta peaches, because what really made them good is they're freestone. They would come off the pit, made them good for canning, and they were very, very firm. If you're going to can a peach and you want it ripe, you don't want it to be mush. Okay, so there's a difference between the ones at our orchard, we call them leaners, where you want to lean over the sink and bite into it. That would not be a good canning peach, because it's not firm but boy, is it good, right? So that one took over. It was commercially available in the 1880s. Samuel Rumpf also became, another one of my little tangents, became more well known for two inventions he had than the Alberta peach. He invented the ice dolly, which was a castored container that they could fill up with ice and then put racks of peaches on top of it, so that when you transported it via rail, it would stay cold. And he also invented the ice train. So he had these dollies that they could quickly roll into the end of a train and fill the whole end of the train up with ice in these dollied racks, and then fill the car with peaches or other produce that needed to stay cold. And that went berserk in the early refrigerated cars. It was all because of Samuel Rumpf. All right, I digress. Back to James Gamble. In 1881, Catawba Island had upped their production to 200,000 bushels of peaches. In 1898, Catawba had upped their production to 300,000 trees, 400,000 bushel of peaches. In a short 19 years, they had gone up to 400,000 bushel. Now, let's put this in perspective. Today, the largest producers of peaches on Catawba Island are from Howell Orchards, Dave Howell. He has 800 or 900 trees. 800 or 900 trees. In 1898, there were 300,000 trees on Catawba Island. Dave Howell had one of his best years ever, as I did. We have, at my orchard, we have 320 trees. And it's all I can handle. And it's all I want to handle. All right? And I don't know how many bushels I got, but my trees are still young because I've had some disasters from the weather, and it wiped out half my crop over a couple of years, young trees. But Dave Howell, in his perhaps best year ever, produced 1,000 bushel of peaches. Compared to 1898, 300,000 trees, 400,000 bushel peaches. 1900, between 1898 and 1900, you think that was something, it really exploded. Because by 1900, there were 600,000 trees, and they produced 700,000 bushel of peaches. Dave Howell produced 1,000 in his best year, and they produced 700,000 bushel of peaches. By the early 1900s, Catawba produced, in 1915, produced 1 million bushel of peaches. Now, for those of you who can stay later on, I have a lot of pictures up here. Along with those came a lot of the industry that went with it, supported it. There were 3 or 4 basket making factories. You know, that's a lot of bushel baskets, right? And half bushel baskets. There was the Port Clinton Basket Factory was located kitty corner from where Wendy's is now in Port Clinton. You know, the empty lot with the mural on the side, and next to it is like a Subway sandwich place. That entire block was the Port Clinton Basket Factory. And they got contracts every year to create those wooden, woven bushel baskets and half bushel baskets and packed baskets. There was one in Oak Harbor, a basket factory. There was one in Elmore, a basket factory. The Port Clinton one burned down halfway through its life expectancy. It was going great guns. And so I want you to bear with me. This is a letter I found that James Gamble, not a letter, it was an article he wrote for the Rural New Yorker in 1909. So by this time, James Gamble was 74 years old. He'd been growing peaches for 36 years. By the way, I will stop talking in a timely manner. And then any questions you have, I'll hang around for 10 or 15 minutes and we'll open it up to questions. So be writing down your questions. If you don't have to ask me about how many gallons in the lake because you already know that. All right. This is an article he wrote in 1908 for the Rural New Yorker. It's a couple pages long, but I think there's some really interesting stuff in here about life in the Peach Days and in Catawba, etc. So bear with me. I had taken advantage of a widely advertised excursion from Cincinnati to Tampa in November 1905 to visit some relatives in Tampa and attend the Florida State Fair at that place. The clerk of the weather was in good humor, no doubt, for we had the entire 3 weeks that I was there the most delightful weather I had ever experienced at that season of the year, and I went back home in love with the climate of Florida. Right? Huh? The first thing I said to my wife on reaching home was, "We are going to spend the winter in Florida." "Why, how can we?" she replied. "What will you do with the horse, the cow, and that big flock of chickens?" "I don't know," I said, "but we're going, that's sure." And I told her that I heard one man in Tampa say, speaking of the soil, "white sand." I spoke of it as poor. He replied, "Yes, that's so. 'Tisn't as rich as some of your northern land, but our climate is worth $100 an acre." So I commenced at once to figure out how we were going to Florida. The result was I chartered a freight car to take our 325 hens and pullets, our cow, and a lot of furniture from Catawba Island to Tampa, Florida. And he did it. For this, we paid $126, and an attendant was allowed free passage to go with the car to care for the livestock. The household goods were put in one end of the car, the cow in the other end, and the 325 chickens in 24 coops occupied the center, being placed 4 coops long, 2 coops wide, and 3 coops high, which left plenty of room for feeding and water for the entire route. This car left Gibson on the Lakeshore Road Railroad the night of December 28, 1905, and was hauled via Toledo and Cincinnati, Ohio, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Jacksonville, Florida, to Tampa, arriving at the latter place on the morning of January 4th, 1906. The car was detained at several transfer stations from 5 to 10 hours each time, or would have made a quicker trip. The stock, however, came through in excellent condition, the cow giving milk and some of the biddies laying eggs on the way. The remainder of our family started from home January 1st and landed in Jacksonville over the Queen and Crescent Railway January 4th and Tampa that night. We found our young man had arrived that morning and had moved into the house, and the cow and chickens on lots engaged for us by friends. On January 5th, we set to work and soon had sheds, not houses, built with roosts and nests under them for our chickens, enclosing them with wire fencing. The cow we stabled in one corner with small yard for her to run in. She did not fail in her milk, but continued to give us a generous supply of good milk during our stay in Tampa. What milk was not used by the family was readily disposed of at 10 cents per quart. We sold the cow for $50 to, quote, Major, it's the person's name. We sold the cow for $50 to Major, an old colored man who owns her yet, and in reply to a proposition to buy her, made by me the other day, said, "No, sir, that cow ain't for sale. My old woman won't take no $100 for that cow." After Major bought her, she was taken with the tick fever, but he called on a cow doctor who soon cured her with the aid of the owner, who combed the ticks off and washed the cow with strong soap suds. She soon recovered and was presented her owner with a heifer calf, which he values almost as much as he does the cow. Both are flourishing in the balmy climate of Florida. As to the poultry, they proved to be a veritable gold mine. We fed them with corn, wheat, and oats, kept grit and oyster shells by them all the time, and gave them plenty of water 3 times a day. We sold 25, of which left us 300. They commenced to lay right away, and soon we were getting from 100 to 150 eggs per day. During the month of February, we got 12 to 14 dozen a day, At first, we sold eggs for 35 cents a dozen, then 30 cents a dozen. And by the last of February, the prices fell to 25 cents a dozen. But the result finally footed up like this. The feed for cow and chickens cost us $20 a month. The rent for the house and the lots, $20 a month. In Florida. Keep in mind, that's Florida. And besides the eggs used in the family, we sold enough to pay for food and rent and had nearly $50 left over, though some of this was for milk sold, probably $15. March 1, we sold the outfit and went back to our delightful summer home on Catawba Island in Lake Erie. We left 3 of our family there. They spent the past summer with us, and now we are back in Tampa to spend the winter with them. I sold off 450 choice hens and pullets before leaving Catawba this time, that being what was left out of nearly 1,000 rocks and Wyandottes I raised last spring with incubators and brooders. Our peach crop on Catawba Island this year was a bonanza. Fruit of all kind being scarce east of us. They had a freeze that year. All of Pennsylvania and New York lost all their peaches, which, by the way, this year was not untypical. I don't know if you heard, Georgia this last year lost its entire crop, maybe 90+%, and South Carolina lost 70 to 80% of their crop. And that's strictly just a late frost. When the trees are in blossom, it happens. And this was a big year for that. So what happened here, he benefited from being in Catawba because the Catawba peaches survived, being surrounded by how many gallons?
76.332 bazillion.
Bazillion, yeah. Rita's got it. See, there are a few of you listening. So they were surrounded by all those bazillion gallons of warm water. It saved his blossoms, and as it did mine this last year. Okay, our peach crop on Catawba Island this year was a bonanza. Fruit of all kinds being scarce east of us. Commissioned men from almost all the large cities east of us came and paid $2 a bushel and up for peaches, some as high as $4 and even $5 a bushel for every choice large fruit. Catawba Island shipped this season about 100,000 bushels of choice peaches. Choice is the key here, because I gave you figures much greater than that. A choice peach was hard to come by in those days. That means it wasn't bug bit, it wasn't small, it wasn't deformed, and it had great color. And there were sorting houses. There was a sorting house near the railroad in Port Clinton. There was the fruit company out here in Catawba. They were up everywhere. And the farmers would sell their peaches to a great extent just to these houses at wholesale prices, and then they would take care of the sorting, the packaging, the shipping, the sales, and it didn't leave a whole lot for them, actually. Along those lines, I had prices here on peaches. In 1905, you could actually buy a peach tree in 1905 for somewhere between 6 and 10 cents. Okay, and that actually hasn't gone up a bazillion amount. It's today wholesale. You can get them for $16 to $20. Okay, you're used to the big box stores where they're going to cost you $45 or $50, but 6 to 10 cents. In 1921, it went up to as high as 30 to 50 cents, and today 15 to 20. Here's the interesting thing, though. Those bushel baskets, 8 cents a piece. It cost 8 cents a piece. Now, when you think about it, if you're only getting $1.50 or $2 a bushel, and the basket itself cost 8 cents, here was the kicker. That some of the crops were so good, they would stack these 3 high on a wagon. And to go 3 high, they didn't cover them with nets anymore. They had to get wooden lids. There's another 2.5 cents down the drain. So they had 10.5 cents invested in these wooden baskets. And so times were tough. Not that tough. James Gamble died 8 years after he wrote that in 1916. He died of hepatitis. He was 84 years old, and at the time he died, he was the oldest resident of Catawba Island. There was, I saw a record of somebody that had made it to 90 just 4 or 5 years before that, but they must have passed away. I couldn't find that part. But he was the oldest resident of Catawba Island when he died. His wife Rose lasted until 1930 when she passed away. They are both buried right here in Catawba. Their gravesite is, I just went and visited this last week. It's a really nice old marble headstone, and it's quite nice. So, after the Gambles, okay, who stole my notes? All right, 1900s, 600,000 trees, 700,000 bushel. By the early 1900s, there was 1 million bushel. After James Gamble, it continued, well, it tapered off a bit. It actually started to taper off a little bit because a lot of the growers were getting older and older and older, and some of them decided to throw in the towel. But some of the things that helped it grow, and some of these will ring a bell. The Matthews Boat Company, 1890. So we're starting to get some. 1907, the Celtex Company. 1913. At the same time, the fishing industry here was humongous. In 1913, there were at least 8 fish companies on the Portage River and 2 here in Catawba, and they harvested 14 million pounds of fish. So earlier when I said a lot of the farmers, they also worked in the fishing industry. So they would, and that's why they liked to have everything concise. You know, they wanted 2 or 3 varieties of peaches so they could all come in at one time. They could send them off to be canned and then get back to their fishing, which was the real steady income. 1918, Erie Army Depot and USG came in. Around that time, transportation started coming along, and now we were switching a little bit more to retail than wholesale because local people could come and say, geez, let's go get a couple bushel of peaches and I'll can them, as opposed to buying the cans. And so the farmers now, they're starting to look for peaches that will extend the season. I had a discussion here with Brad earlier, and he said, well, how long is the season? And I said, well, we start getting peaches in 4th of July. And most everybody here, if I had asked you, would probably said they come in August. Until you realize that now, because there's 400 varieties to choose from, we can get a variety that, a peach will only come in for 5, 6, 7 days a year, and it comes in the same time every year. If you want to sell retail and you want to have a long season, we have 20 varieties. And the first ones come in about the 4th of July. And about the time that they peter out, the next variety comes in, and the next variety, and the next variety, and the next variety, until we get all the way through the summer. Red Haven, that you're all familiar with, doesn't come in until the first week of August. That's why probably a lot of you think that that's when peaches come in. And I was going to talk about Red Haven, but I may not. I'll save that for question and answers. So industry was coming in like crazy. 1935, Standard Products came in. Now we're selling retail. We're looking for peaches that will spread out the season. So along comes pressure from 3 gentlemen who lobbied Congress to get to allow a patent on plants. Up until 1930, you could invent, you could find any plant you wanted, but you couldn't patent it. So even like the Alberta, it was never patented because you couldn't. It was a plant. But the 3 people that pushed for that, Luther Burbank, who some of us remember from high school science, who was really good at propagating and crossbreeding plants. Paul Stark, who was partners in one of the largest, and still to this day is one of the largest growers of plant stock for nurseries. And Thomas Edison, you may have heard of him. He was big on inventing things and thought they should be able to invent something and have it actually protected. And those 3 gentlemen lobbied Congress. In 1930, Congress passed the Plant Patent Act and allowed you to patent plants. In fact, patent number 7 of the Plant Protection Act was a peach. I have a copy of it here. It's not named anything we would recognize today, but the 7th patent for a plant was a peach tree. Okay, so now we're starting to see a decline. And the biggest decline that really came in is when New Departure pulled into the area. In 1945, New Departure, a ball bearing company that was located in Connecticut, decided they would open a plant in Sandusky. They announced they were going to build New Departure. They were going to have 4,000 employees. So management slowly started trickling this way as the building was getting built. And if you lived on the East Coast, you paid a lot of money for where you lived, and you made a lot of money, as it is today. But when they came here, they had a lot of money burning in their pockets, and they said, where would you like to live? And, well, why not right on Lake Erie? So we'll go over to Catawba Island, where the growers are now in their upper 70s to mid 80s. They've asked their children already, would you like to take over the orchard? And we all know what the answer was. No. Yeah, and if I had enough time, I could tell you about the amount of work, but it's a lot of work. It's not just stick the tree in there and then pull them off and sell them. There's a lot of work that goes into maintaining, especially 600,000 trees. I can't even conceive of that. So they said, no, we don't want any part of it. We can get a job in one of these manufacturing plants, and you sell it because we'll inherit the money instead of the farm that way, and we'll all be good. So they started selling the property. The value of the property started going up especially in the mid 1940s. And I was told that the New Departure was the one that kind of put it over the top. In 1947, the next death blow was the United States government created the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs Act, which removed the tariffs on imported peaches. This was in exchange for the fact, in the Second World War, we became such a manufacturing center that we wanted the ability to export to all these countries around the world. And in order to export, they decided, well, we better take all these tariffs off so that they won't put tariffs on our things. And so they did, and America got flooded with canned peaches. China was, even then, China was a big producer of things, and they flooded our market with canned peaches, and Greece is a big grower of peaches too. So the value of peaches went down. We've gone from canned to frozen to fresh. The ground back when they bought the land, this is a good one. James Gamble bought 30 acres of land, including a home, in his 1860s for $12,000. He got 30 acres of land and a home on it for $12,000. Andrew Reynolds, 23 acres of land, including a home, for $7,000. If the last orchard here in Catawba, a lot of you knew Bob Schwan. Yeah, wonderful man. He was my original mentor. When I decided I was going to grow peaches, he spent an hour or two with me just telling me everything he could about peaches. And I said, Bob, I'm right down the street from you. I'm going to be growing peaches. Why are you telling me all this stuff? And he said, let me tell you something. I can sell every peach I can grow, and you can sell every peach you grow. And so Bob Schwan's orchard is now for sale in lots. You'll see the development going on. It's behind that little hill that's built there. So you can buy a lot if you like before the price goes up, because they're only $500,000 for a lot. Yeah, you can get a 1 1/4 acre lot down here on Bob Schwan's former. So his descendants weren't all that dumb about saying, no, we don't want the peaches, let's go with the money. I don't mean Bob's, I mean all these other people. So the prices have gone way, way, way up. I guess I'd rather open it up to questions than that. So just last thing I wanted to share with you, and then hopefully I've generated some questions. This is, when people come to our stand, I'm one of the few places that has enough time to talk to them. So I'm an ambassador for Catawba and Catawba peaches. And I tell people all the time about Catawba peaches. But this one is especially a favorite of mine. This was a little card that my grandson wrote about us, and I'll try and work it through for you. He was, we think, 5 or 6 years old. Once upon a time, a papa named Brad bought some land Then he planted, and this is the key one. If you get a chance to look at it later, this can you all see this word right here by my finger? He planted
300.
300. Yeah. 300 peach trees. They grew and grew. Then the peaches grew and grew. Then he picked some peaches. I love you. And complete with white hair and blue jeans. And so I have, for those of you who have time to stay later, I also have some photographs of the sorting houses and wagons lined up to barter their wares, the steamers that came in every day to pick up Catawba peaches, the basket factory in Port Clinton. I have a lot of these. I'll lay them out. You can feel free to come up and go through those. So, with that being said, how about a couple minutes of questions? Here's a question.
I have a couple.
Oh, no, one.
If I may.
Yes.
I'm Paul Moon.
Yes.
The Hardesty Atlas, which I see you have a copy of.
Yes.
The 1875 Hardesty Atlas was the first comprehensive history of the county. And it states that in the current harvest year, and that would have been 1874, Catawba Island and Danbury combined, this is 1874, shipped out over 800,000 bushels of peaches.
Like I said,
Yeah.
different people have different stories and different ways of looking at it. I believe what you want to believe.
And then one other observation.
In contrast to you, the agricultural census of 1880 is where I got a lot of my information, and it lists every cow, every chicken, every apple tree, every peach tree, and every bushel of everything that was harvested in 1879. And it would. Then again, maybe people were still trying to trick the government back then.
Danbury was out.
And maybe Danbury could have been the
Combination.
yes,
of the two.
yeah. And Danbury was certainly part of the
Yeah.
push.
Regarding fishing, Port Clinton was the largest freshwater fish port in the world. And in total fish tonnage, it was third behind Boston
Wow.
and Vladivostok.
Wonderful, wonderful information. And then they went to whale oil, and it did help. It did help with the San Jose scale and also a peach leaf curl. So they had more diseases. It's possible that they did harvest a little less. I can guarantee you they harvested less sellable fruit because of the insects and things. I mean, we spray. Don't get excited. You have to spray peaches, but we do it very, very, very carefully in ways that they couldn't do. I suspect that a half of their crops were unsellable at my stand today because this one only has 7 bug bites and 1 worm kind of thing. And the choice ones, though, they went for a lot. So I think that's it. Yes?
Yeah. When you mentioned canning, is there a label that most of the peaches went under, corporate label, or was it just like mason jar kind of?
I believe in the early days it was just mason jar. No, Del Monte, I'd have to go back and see when Del Monte started up because they were big name in peaches. But I suspect in the beginning they were just jars.
Because, you hear about all the canneries during the Second World War that had all the Italian and German prisoners working in them. Peaches was always mentioned in tomatoes as well.
Yeah, well, we had a cannery right near Railroad Street in Port Clinton, and I can't tell you who worked there, but as a child, that became tomatoes, didn't it? Later on?
Smell it every fall.
Yeah, the whole town, football season, you'd go to the football game and the town smelled like tomatoes, right?
Bowling Green still down.
Yeah.
What peaches that you grow are the best for canning today, and when is their season?
All right. When I get requests, the question is, what are the best peaches for canning today? Early on, everybody is in a rush for good quality, soft, wonderfully ripe peaches, and I get people come in and say, I want 2 bushel of peaches, and I say, I don't think you do. And they say, yes, I do. And I said, you're going to can them or do something with them, aren't you? And they say, yes. And I say, here's a trick. There are two styles of peaches. There are cling peaches and freestone peaches. Cling means it's going to stick on the pit. You can slice it all you want, but part of that peach is going to stay on the pit. They're still wonderful to eat, but if you're going to do a bunch, you want them to come off the pit, which is called a freestone. So I talk those people out of those July peaches and have them come back in August, because the good Lord said, I will give you freestone peaches and I will give you early peaches, but I will not give you early freestone peaches. So the entire month of July, all peaches, not just me, but everybody in this area, they are all cling, and you would be fighting to can. From Red Haven on, all peaches are freestone. Now, freestone, Red Haven is technically a semi-freestone or semi-cling. It's not a true freestone. But from the second week of August on, you've got about a month that any peach you pick then is about the same firmness, about the same flavor, and it's freestone. It's going to come off the pit. The difference year to year, people say, what is the best peach you grow? It changes from year to year. It's all dependent on the weather. If you get 4 or 5 days of rain in the week before you harvest a particular variety, it will not be nearly as good as it could be. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? And what I tell people is, how about, did you ever cut into a cantaloupe? It looks beautiful, it smells beautiful, and you take a bite and it tastes like water, right? It wasn't the grower, it wasn't the variety. It just means just before they picked it, there were 3 or 4 or 5 days of rain, and that thing soaked up like a sponge all that water, and it diffused all the flavors. It's that way on cantaloupe, it's that way on peaches, it's that way on tomatoes. Tomatoes will actually, if you have them in your garden, they'll explode. They fill up with so much water, they'll pop right open. And it's that way on strawberries. Yeah, you want the best year for those fruits are drought years. It may be a little bit smaller, but my God, they're good. So even in one season, this year, for instance, Red Haven, in my wife and I's opinion, was not nearly as good as most all the other varieties of the season. But people would come and say, I want Red Haven. We'd sell them Red Haven. They'd come back the next week, or they'd come back 2 weeks later when they couldn't get Red Haven. They say, I want some more Red Haven because those were the best peaches I ever ate. And I'm thinking, oh, man. It was, right just before the beginning of August, it rained and rained and rained and rained. Not to mention the rest of the summer, but that's what you want, drought. Yes?
So when I was reading the news, when the Georgia and South Carolina crops mostly failed, they were talking about warmer winters, so the trees weren't really experiencing a hard cold, and then warm enough temperatures to get them to blossom. And so what we call like a late frost was really just your typical frost, because they had bloomed out so early, wiping out those trees. Are you seeing similar issues with peach orchards here?
There are over 400 varieties of peaches. A large portion of those will not grow here, because every variety has what the industry calls chill hours. And for instance, I think already it has to be at 50 hours below 40 degrees in order for its fruit to come to fruition the next year. Those are chill hours. Some are 600 hours, some are 700 hours, some are 800 hours of hours below 40 degrees, or 35 to 40 degrees. A lot of the peaches that are grown in Georgia and South Carolina will not grow here because they have picked ones that have lower chill hours. Their chill hours might be 200. And that's why you don't see peaches in Florida, for instance, because they're still trying to develop varieties that will go with 0 chill hours. The tree just says, I'm not going to do it. I haven't gone through winter yet. I'm not going to do it. I haven't gone through winter yet. It is how much a person believes that our weather is changing is debatable, but I will tell you that Georgia is, I don't believe any longer the capital of South Carolina has taken over production of peaches, and Georgia is actually you're going to be seeing more and more blueberries. Georgia is going to become the unofficial blueberry state. They'll probably still have the license plate that says the peach state, but yes?
I thought when France
had all their vines die, and the United States saved them. I thought some of those came from Catawba. I thought we sent some of our...
Not likely. I think Don Rhodes would have told you that American grapes did save Europe because they had a blight that was going through Europe, and the grapes that we had brought from Europe, which would not be the Catawba, which is one of just a few native grapes, had built up an immunity to the things that were going on in Europe, and they'd been isolated. So we were able to export those grapes back into Europe and save their asses. But I don't think so. I think, I'd venture to guess the Catawba and the Concord were 95% of all the grapes that were grown in Catawba. Yes?
How much, I often wonder about when you buy a peach, when it was picked. Do some of them like pick them green and then they like store them?
All right.
Or they do something, or, you know, I often wondered.
Did you all hear that question? All right, he wanted to know, is a peach picked at its perfect ripeness or a couple days early, etc. This brings me to Red Haven again, because everybody thinks Red Haven is God's gift to peaches. And it wasn't because of its taste that Red Haven became popular. It was because it was the first truly red-skinned peach that had ever been created. What's his name? I think his name was Dr. Johnson, Stanley Johnson, out of Michigan State University. In their New Haven, Connecticut research lab, created the Red Haven, the whole Haven series. There was Red Haven, Hale Haven, a couple other Havens. But Red Haven was a red peach. Up until that time, most peaches were predominantly yellow, which means when they got bruised, as they got older or shipped, they would show their bruises. It also means if they were picked 2, 3, 4, 5 days early, when they were extremely firm and could be shipped without bruising heavily, they would not only show the bruises, because they were predominantly yellow with a blush of red, but the green that was still on them, because they were picked too early, was very visible. The Red Haven, being predominantly red, almost completely red, could be picked a couple, 2, 3 days early, would not show its bruises when it did bruise, and would cover up the green in it that showed that it was too early. And the farmers loved it because they could pawn it off on you as being freestone, number one, which it wasn't, and not bruised, which it probably was, and picked too early, which it may have been, although when we went to fresh fruit, that's the difference between your grocery store peach and the roadside peach. Theirs was picked 4, 5, 6 days early, but more importantly, in transportation and shipping it around, it got stored in refrigerated areas for up to 6 weeks. And when you do that to a peach, it slowly dehydrates, which makes them that mealy taste. Now, that's the difference between store-bought. At the roadside stand, I pick them usually 1 day early, which is still good enough to eat, but just not a wiener yet. But that keeps the birds out, because the birds are a huge enemy. In fact, in the early 1900s, did you know that you could take the scalp of a blackbird to the Ottawa County Commissioners and get paid a ½ cent per scalp of a blackbird? There was a bounty on blackbirds in Ottawa County, as there were in a lot of counties around America. And to bring the stock down, you could get... So you could... What do you do for a living? Oh, I hunt blackbirds. I'm a blackbird bounty hunter. So that's why that's really what got Red Haven its start, and so it covered it all up. Yeah, other yes.
So did you buy the orchard, or was it?
My orchard?
Yes.
My orchard. My wife and I bought our orchard in 2004 from the Booty Wallers family. I refrained from saying the whole family's name because his wife's name was Clitora. And so we bought our farm from Clitora Wallers because Booty had passed away. She was soon went to a nursing home. Our property was a peach orchard in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. In the mid to early 70s, there was a freeze one winter that killed every tree in their orchard. And then they never replanted. So when we got to our orchard, there was not a tree in it, and there hadn't been for some 30 years. So, which is good, because one of the things that hurts is peach trees really need to be planted in new ground. If you plant generation after generation in the same ground, it pulls the wrong nourishments out, and you get nematodes and things that attack those roots. So it was good that it had that rest. But
Okay.
thank you.
Just a little sense of humor here. Being from Port Clinton and all. And I can remember way back when all the construction, building new homes, was going on out here. And there was a gentleman that lived on Catawba Island, but he moved out to California. I don't remember his name, but he wrote something, editorial, I think it was in the Beacon, that of the history, in the sense of how great it was, all the peach orchards and everything. Now with all the changes, what's going to happen to the peach orchards?
So with that being said, there are 3 orchards left. There's mine, Dave Howell's, and Quinstock. At one time, there were thought to be about 100 orchards. And they were humongous, as you can see. Every one of those has more than all 3 of us put together. Any one of those, and they had hundreds of them, or 100 of them.
So
Yeah.
peaches have to be picked by hand?
Yes, yeah. There isn't any really good method of machine picking peaches, which is part. So in March, every tree gets pruned. It takes about 15 minutes per tree to prune a peach tree. You have to bring it down, you have to bring it in, and you have to empty the center. A peach tree is hollow in the center. If you ever get a chance to look at one of mine or somebody else's, there's no central trunk. I can stand in the middle of my trees. That allows light and airflow in, because mildew and things are an enemy. So we have to prune every tree. It takes about 15 minutes a tree. Figure that out times 3,000 trees, what they had to go through. Then in May, we thin the peaches. When the peach gets to be about the size of my little finger, we twist off 90% of all the peaches that the tree puts on. The tree puts on peaches that look like grape clusters. If I took a branch this long, it might have 75 peaches on it. And when I get done twisting off, it'll have 2 to 3. It makes a bigger peach. It makes a better tasting peach. It keeps the insects from crawling in between crowded peaches and boring into it. And it keeps the tree from breaking itself in half, which they do all the time. Even when we thin them. When you get those stormy nights and you have 200 pounds of peaches swinging like this, you go through the orchard the next day and you'll have 2 or 3 trees that are broken in half, even though you have props under them and everything else and do everything. So then that takes it takes me about a month to do my 300 trees on pruning. It takes me about a month to do 320 trees on thinning. And then, of course, you have spraying every 8 to 12 days, depending on how much rain you've had. And then you have the picking, and picking is very time, because a tree doesn't, you don't come up to a tree and take every peach off of it. You have to determine each peach whether it's ripe and ready to come off, or whether it needs to stay for another couple days. So it takes a long time to can you imagine 1 million bushel of peaches?
No.
With that being said, I'll stay around and answer questions on an individual basis. You're welcome to come up and look at my signs of the factories and the peach growing sorting houses and things. I thank you for inviting me. Last time, by the way, we had we were at the orchard and we had alcohol.